extending. And there are lots of questions about, in the material that I'm doing right now and getting ready for, what is the role of something like, let's say, medical missions or education on the mission field? And is it a support role? Is it something that can be seen legitimate in and of itself? Or is just preaching a legitimate form of missions? And anything else is just sort of a sideline. Now, the question here is, how do you create a church that falls into these three categories? Because in the early days of missions, that was not the goal. Now, their goal was not to create dependence either. But when you are someone like William Carey or such, and you're making shoes in your basement of your house, and you're thinking, there are people in India that are dying, you're not thinking through the long-term effect and strategy of what's going to happen 100 years from now. You're just worried about that pressing concern. And then you go and you do something about it. Or you're trying to overcome a social ill, like slavery. Or you're trying to minister to Indians that happen to be congregating around your church in America, and so you're going to be doing that. You're not thinking about other things. There comes a time when the question is, are we trying to create a native church that is in and of itself self-supporting and sustaining and independent of a need from the Europeans or whomever that are going there to minister? And that's a legitimate concern if in the long run you can create issues of dependence that are built into the missionary enterprise. And a lot of unintentional difficulties have arisen from sometimes missionary agencies or countries with deep pockets that pour money into the mission field and create a very different socioeconomic relationship between the missionary and the mission field and how that plays itself out. Now, as we mentioned, the first crisis that developed here was that the Church Mission Society was strapped financially, and the field missionaries were told that they needed to develop their own sources of income, and that's what I should say there. They needed more development as an independent agency, and they couldn't. England was in a recession. They wouldn't have called it that then, but they were in a recession, and this would take some time to achieve. Not only from the standpoint that the missionaries on the field would be willing to know how to live with less, but also to create a sense of obligation on the part of the local native population that they were to give money and support the mission work themselves. And you first have to convince them to do that, and then explain how that money is going to be used. And especially if they're not used to spending money or handling resources, all of that has to be trained. And then, of course, you may have to just allow them to deal with things and money the way they would normally do it, which is different than the way the Europeans might. And this will be linked to the formation of an indigenous ministry, ministers, people who are actually doing the ministry work, who are native, and to encourage that in a more systematic way. Henry Venn's first policy paper on the subject of missions, which was written in 1851, is called this right here: The Employment and Ordination of Native Teachers. And he suggests three things that are of importance. One, the role of Western missionaries should be adjusted and should be changed. And this was maybe a more policy paper. Before this, they may not have had, there are churches that function fine for 75 years without a mission statement. Then a new young pastor comes in that says you have to have a mission statement. And people say, what do you mean? We've been functioning fine without one. And then, of course, you find out that you can't do anything that's not in the mission statement. And so the women who get together and knit every Saturday afternoon at the church are told they have to go home. There's nothing in the mission statement about knitting doilies on Saturday afternoon. Well, some things you just let go, whether or not it's in the mission statement or not. You just let them knit away. But he felt that the European missionary should primarily be involved as pioneers, opening up new areas of ministry, and that the established fields should be slowly, and in his case, more rapidly turned over to mature national Christians who could take over that responsibility. And then the people who were European would go off and start a new work. And so if there was no reason to import Europeans that were doing things that the natives, the indigenous people could do themselves, that you were ministering to. So once they became mature, they can take over. You don't have to bring someone from England to do that. They have their own. So in some cases, evangelistic preaching to the unconverted, instruction of inquirers and recent converts, those were things that the missionary would do, and maybe more of a pioneer area. And things like discipleship and training and things that would be done within the context of support ministry within an established community, and pastoring and primary, of course, a pastor can do evangelizing too, but the idea of community maintenance, that would be for the local church, the local population to do. He saw that the role of native teachers were responsible for pastoral care in established congregations, and these with proven abilities were to be appointed as catechists, and that would be the entry-level area of interns, or a catechist is someone who reads scripture and does other types of tasks. And so there were jobs in the church that you were required to turn over to them, to train them to eventually take over fully. Ministries to congregations until a native pastor was available. So the missionary was really trying to work himself out of a job. He would pastor a local congregation as long as that was necessary, but as soon as you had one of these catechists that you felt was capable of taking over, you would. Now, of course, some people can say that they want to retire, but when they find a replacement, then it isn't the right time yet. And that can happen until everyone is ready to throw him out. So there are times when you really have to be committed to this. I know this, that Earl Bowen, who is Miss Bowen's brother, he was the academic dean at maybe Nairobi Theological College, anyway, over in Africa, and they were working to Africanize, if you want to call that, the school. And they were doing that, but they were shocked to find out that his job as academic dean, it was included in that. So he was let go. Years later, they brought him back. I don't know why that was, but it was many years later. They invited him to come back and do that again. I have a feeling that it wasn't because the native person failed, but maybe it did fine. And just moved on or retired or whatever the case may be. And so when they hired him a second time, they did because he was good at it. When they were looking for a replacement. that took a lot of grace on his part to be let go, and then they invited him back. And because at that point, he was doing other things. I mean, he wasn't trying to get back in. But you need to be willing to work yourself out of a job in a situation like this. The ultimate objective of a mission was a native church under native pastors upon a self-supporting system. So when you're sending people to the mission field, that's your goal. You want to create a church that is run by the native population, that has native pastors, and that is in a self-supporting system where their own contributions primarily cover the expenses of the operation. You don't want to create an operation that requires Western support because it's too expensive. You want to do it in a way that meets their own economic situation. You want to create euthanasia in missions, not by killing off your people, but of the mission itself. The goal is, within the three self system, is that when you go into an area, you expect eventually the field will be closed. Because what you went there to do will be done. And then you can move on to some other place. Sort of like what happened in Hawaii, where after 30 years of ministry, the mission board said, we don't need to have a field here anymore. Those missionaries that want to stay can do so, but you're going to come under the native leadership. If you want to still be a missionary, you have to go somewhere else. But we're pulling out. And you won't be a missionary anymore. You can stay in Hawaii and live there and work, but you're just going to be one of them. And you might still be in charge, but you might not. This is euthanasia, a happy death. When the missionary was able to resign all pastoral work to native pastors. And this would be like a joyful ceremony of coming of age on the mission field. That you've come to the place where you're able to deal with this. You can keep in touch with the missionary for advice and support like you would any other time. But the goal would be at some point there would be a grand celebration of not liberation, from oppression, but that you're just on your own now. It's like growing up. It's like, turning 18, whatever the case may be, getting your driver's license. That's the idea here, that the local church now is going to take charge. You've brought them to the place where they can run their own affair. Eventually, or gradually relaxing leadership over the pastors until that is completely ceased. And the mission became an independent native church that might affiliate with a home organization, but on more equal terms. Now, the Yorba mission of the Church Missionary Society to Nigeria. Now, at first, Venn saw the need for native pastors to be supervised by Europeans, and I think that probably was a reasonable assumption that just like you would expect any recent convert to be supervised by someone who had more experience, be sure in some ways that the Europeans were actually more experienced. But nonetheless, that I think is true. The mission was to provide some salaries and subsidies, but to preserve the moral and educational standards that were to be observed within the mission school and training. So at first, they would give some money, not only to the European missionaries, but also to the pastors that they were ministering to. And they would also want to make sure that there were standards of moral standards or educational standards that would be maintained, and they would see to that early on. Yorubian recaptured slaves in Sierra Leone. So slaves that had been captured here in Nigeria are being taken to some other part of the world, captured by the British and taken to Sierra Leone, were sent back here to their home area. And this is where the homeland of Western Nigeria, this was in 1845, 2 European missionaries went to supervise. The distinctives of this Yoruba mission, recaptive Yoruba people formed the nucleus of the church, and that would be native missionaries, converts that were from that area. Recaptive Yoruba people contributed to the missionary effort and were let's say, recaptured individuals that were sent back to their homeland would have been lay people, and there were also people in this category that were seen as capable missionaries. The spread of the gospel in Yoruba land was accomplished primarily through the ministry of native clergy and laymen, not European missionaries. So this whole area of Western Nigeria and Eastern Benin, this maybe even would have been a separate nation if it wasn't carved up by European colonization. But this is a people group right there on the Atlantic coast.
Hi, my name is Mus.
Okay, now this is a description of a little more general idea, but how Christianity comes to Nigeria. The Nigerian church tells about this in some ways, but also in a little more in depth of missions in West Africa.
So thought about something this morning. Religion and how important it is and how it affects everything that we do. It reminds me of the undergrad days because we were very privileged to have very good, brilliant lecturers like Professor Igwe, Dr. Akode, that taught us history, through prehistoric architecture, through different civilizations, all the way to the modern architecture. And in these courses, we could see the importance of how religion has evolved all the way to the present age. So an idea came to my mind. Why not have a sit down with one of these great minds and let you and I educate ourselves on the beginning of religion, how and when it came into Nigeria. So I've been trying to get Dr. Akande to sit for some minutes and have a talk. It's no lie, it's been really difficult, but I was able to get to him. And here is what he had to say.
So my name is Dame Akande. I'm an art and architecture historian with the Department of Architecture, University of Lagos. I am particularly interested in sculpture, but added to that, I find church history and church architecture a sentimental topic for me. All right, so the question is, when did foreign religion get into Nigeria? By foreign religion, I imagine you mean the two old religions of the book, that's Islam and Christianity. In this case, Christianity will probably be more in the picture because it then ties us to England, who were colonial adventurers. I think it's important to say from the get-go that the people who occupy the space we now call Nigeria, they've been in contact with the Arab world for close to 400 years, even before the Europeans came near. In fact, up until the end of the 4th century, all forms of communication between the whole of West Africa and the outside world was essentially done through the Sahara Desert, and the Berbers of Northern Africa had a lot to do with it. Also, the caravans that would come from the Arab world into the fringes of the desert.
There are evidences to show that caravans transporting goods and itinerant Islamic scholars have been traversing the desert to make contact with Africans at the fringes for over 1,000 years.
So there are two main accounts of how Christianity came to Nigeria, and to a certain degree of accuracy, I think it's safe to say I can call them the Catholic account and the Anglican account. Obviously, there are several other accounts, but these two are the oldest that we know. Now, the Catholic account appears to be less known. It's usually used as a footnote, and you'll find stories attached to early Portuguese mariners visiting the Bight of Benin to come for trade and glory. But on the other hand, the Anglican version is a more boisterous, robust story of how Christianity came. It would often speak of the enterprise organized by the British government to come and save the dark continent, as they used to call Africa at that time. The light that they proposed to bring, technically, is Christianity. Or, to put it more appropriately, I would say is trade with a chance of Christianity.
According to what Dr. Akode told me in my second year, in 1841, after months of debate and lobbying on the floor of the English Parliament, a group of evangelicals finally succeeded in convincing the House that it is in everyone's interest to put an end to what has become an obnoxious trade in slaves and seek some humane economic relationship with the interior of Africa. With this as a background, the stage was set for formation of Society for Extinction of Slave Trade and Civilization of Africa in 1839. In the forefront of this crusade were men like W. Wilberforce, Clarkson, and later Sir Thomas Forward Boxing. Their combined efforts with the help of the British government led to the now famous 1841 Niger expedition. Though generally seen as a failed attempt, the expedition is often referred to as the beginning of Christianity in Nigeria.
That would be true. But in context of the inquiry we're speaking about here, it would not be quite accurate. The very first contact of Christianity with the space we now call Nigeria happened about 350 years even before the Niger expedition, and it happened in Benin. So the Niger expedition was in 1841. 3 vessels were commissioned to come to the coast of West Africa, particularly to the Bight of Benin. They were the Albert, the Wilberforce, and the Sudan. On their way from England, they had stopped at Sierra Leone to pick up representatives of the Church Mission Society, and 2 key figures got on board. First was the Reverend J.F. Schun, so a German ethnographer, was a linguist and a missionary, extremely brilliant linguist, I must add. Then the other key fellow is the former slave boy, Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who was later to become the very first black bishop in human history. The thing with the 1841 mission was that it was generally regarded as something that failed because it ended abruptly. The sheer amount of mortality amongst the white members of the expedition generally affected the impact of the expedition. The reason for the death is simple: malaria. In spite of the shortfalls of the expedition, certain inroads were made into the propagation of Christianity and also trade treaties all through Niger Delta, Agbo, and places just right above Agbo. Unlike the 1841 expedition that ended abruptly, and in fact the impact was only to be seen in further expeditions, the earlier visit of the Portuguese that happened about 350 years before this 1841 expedition has a different story. In fact, if I were to answer your question directly, that when did we have the first contact with Christianity, it will be in the 15th century through the Portuguese.
When the missionaries arrived, the people of Onisha were at war with their neighbors, the Ogidi people, and as a consequence of this war, a great number of houses were deserted in the east part of town, where a constant lookout was kept for approach of enemies. According to Crowder's report, 20 Onisha men were killed as against 3 of their enemies. In the state of these affairs, Crowder stated, Onisha people welcomed European traders and missionaries in order to strengthen their own positions. People of those days would do anything to gain the fear and admiration of neighboring villages. Perhaps this was the reason the Oba of Benin in 1472 welcomed the white man into his town for the first time in their history.
In 1472, there was a Portuguese mariner called Kieje Sequeira who had visited Benin. This was during the time of Oba Iwari. This is the oldest account of a white man entering into the space we know now as Nigeria. Unfortunately, not much was achieved by way of a relationship for this 1472 visit, because at that time, Oba Iware was at the point of restructuring Benin and trying to forge it into an empire. It will be 13 years later, in 1485, during the reign of Oba Ozulua, another group of Portuguese mariners that made their way to Benin. The reception at this time was a little more welcoming. In fact, this was said to be the first time when the Portuguese were actually welcomed to court, as against Sequeira's time, who it wasn't even received at court. Now, at this time, I must mention, is the first documented time when the gospel of Jesus was preached to the Benin people. How it flourished is another matter entirely, because in spite of the fact that there were a few converts and priests, catechists were made of certain members of the Benin tribe, it appeared to us in history that the king Ozulua and the Portuguese were actually more interested in something else, something the Portuguese found in Benin, which they call pimenta de apple. It's pepper. This is not the pepper we hear about in Idugora in Lagos. Pepper had been an important product and a basis for the negotiation of relationship since antiquity in Africa. On account of the provision of pepper to the Portuguese, the relationship got fired up and it appeared that it would be sustained. But no sooner than the Portuguese left, and probably the smell of the incense they used for certain masses in Benin at that time faded into thin air, that the Benin returned to the traditions of their father. The arrangement between the Portuguese and the Benin at that point was a thing of strategic positioning. The law at that point was that you could not sell ammunition to any state who was not a Christian state. So it made sense for the Benin people, probably under the pretext of wanting to get trade with the Portuguese, to accept Christianity, however superficially, and then engage in trade. This, I suspect, is what happened, because clearly after the Portuguese left, they returned to traditional worship. More than Benin, in fact, it was Warri. Warri received the same set of Portuguese trader cum missionaries, and the records show that the Warri people were a bit more accepting of Christianity, because unlike Benin, where the religion did not quite thrive quite quickly, in Warri, reverse was the case. It was accepted and it thrived, and there were no noticeable interruptions to the growth of Christianity in Warri for about 200 years. The then Olu of Warri, around the late 1500s, is famed to be the first Olu of Warri who became a Christian convert. He also is said to have gotten Western education through the aid of the Portuguese. The religion has not only survived, it's also thrived in this space that we now call Nigeria. However, it did not do that without its own share of challenges. The story of the Reverend J.C. Taylor comes to mind. He was a young former slave from Igbo extraction who came with the Bishop Ajayi Crowther in much later years to Onitsha. In fact, J.C. Taylor is recorded to have been the individual who started the first Christian mission in the whole of the Igbo country. J.C. Taylor, supported by Simon Jonas, was instrumental to the propagation of Christianity among the Igbos in the early 19th century. An important thing he milited in his journal was on August 20th, 1857. That was the first Sunday he spent in Onitsha. He was to have a service, and in the service he had recorded that he had an attendance of about 200 to 400 naked people. That's a very tough crowd to preach the gospel to. He was luckily joined by sailors and some men from Sierra Leone who were also Christian converts at that service. And one very touching and interesting note he made was that having preached the sermon for the first time in the Igbo country, he was joined by the Sierra Leoneans and they sang the hymn, Jesus shall reign where the sun. The hymn is beautiful and apt, if you ask me. It's a hymn composed by Isaac Watts in the late 17th century, and the music, the popular tune for it, was composed by John Hayton.
One can say it has thrived through the years as evidence in growth and followership of the faith.
Yes, absolutely. I would say that the religion not only survived, but it thrived amongst the people of Nigeria, probably more of the lower Niger. In spite of the pressures and the challenges, it is still here today, and it continues to fight for a right of place in what I might call our collective consciousness.
Okay, so that is Nigeria and the coming of the gospel there. I need to remember. The coming of the gospel there. Now here, Samuel Ijai Prowler, and was mentioned here in the video that we saw. He is someone who should be far more celebrated than he may be. He was born a member of the Yoruba mission in 1807, taken captive at age 13 by Muslim traders, and served as a domestic slave for several years, and then sold to Portuguese traders in 1822 for transport to America. His slave ship, fortunately, was intercepted by the British Royal Navy, and liberated in Sierra Leone, educated by the Church Missionary Society, and demonstrated ability in 1841 during the Niger expedition, even though it had failed primarily because so many of the Europeans died during that expedition, and little or no trading partnerships and absolutely no experimental farms were set up. But nonetheless, he demonstrated that he was certainly capable of not only surviving such an event, but also having issues with it. Ordained an Anglican priest in England in 1843, and I know when I teach church history, I mention him in there because he is seen as the very first African to be ordained as an Anglican priest in the history of the Anglican Church. And I wouldn't be surprised soon if there's an African Archbishop of Canterbury. There's so many Anglicans in Kenya and Africa in general. And so there's lots and lots of Anglicans in Africa now. So that's so they've done a great work there. Ministered with the European leadership in the Yoruba mission. So it's been very effective. Yes, sorry about that. Okay.
Year 1807, the British Parliament passed the law abolishing the slave trade, which had before then lasted for over 3 centuries. These events will have far-reaching effects on the lives of many Africans who were being enslaved and sold to slavery in the New World through European slave traders and their African collaborators. One of them being a young boy who was born 2 years after these events, who would later on grow up to become a foremost linguist, an explorer, a clergy, and the first black bishop of the Anglican Church. And he was one of the men whose works laid the foundation of the country Nigeria. His name, Samuel Ajayi Crowther. In the early 19th century, the area currently known as Southwest Nigeria was in turmoil. The Oyo Empire, which had ruled this area for centuries, had collapsed. Devastation and bloodshed on account of raging wars were the order of the day. Slave raids had become the norm, and many lived in fear and uncertainty. These were definitely dangerous times. It was in the midst of this chaos that a young riverman named Ayemi and his wife Afala, a descendant of the 18th Alaafin of Oyo Oba Abiodun, had a baby boy. Being born facing down, the boy was named Ajayi in line with the Yoruba tradition, and as a common practice those days, The new parents consulted a oracle to inquire about the future of their newborn. Something strange, however, happened. The diviner told the couple that the newborn was not to enter any of the cults of the Orisha, the divinities of Yoruba pantheon, because he was to be a servant of Eledumare, the god of heaven. The young boy grew up in the love and security of his family and community, and like many boys of his age, he took to farming, and he even made some money of it even as a little boy until one day when war got to his doorsteps. On a fateful morning at about 9 a.m., while many had gone to their farms and their various areas of occupation, a rumor was spread in the town that enemy warriors had approached with intentions of hostility. The town, containing about 12,000 inhabitants and producing 3,000 fighting men, wasn't duly prepared for this attack and was easily overrun by this army of 20,000 men that had besieged them. The attackers were mostly Fulani warriors and converted Oyo Muslims. Although the men of the town put up a feeble defense, the battle was effectively over after 3 hours, and what followed was carnage and bloodbath that will stay in the mind of young Ajayi forever. Women clutching to their babies and children while running for safety as fast as they could through prickly shrubs. And while they were endeavoring to disentangle themselves from the ropey shrubs, they were overtaken and caught by the enemies by a rope noose thrown over the neck of every individual, to be led in the manner of goats tied together under the drove of one man. Families violently separated to never see themselves again. Little Ajayi, now 12, was thus caught with his mother, 2 sisters, 1 infant about 10 weeks old, and a cousin while trying to escape. The last time he would set eyes on his father was when the latter had come to give them the signal to escape, following the collapse of the town's defense. He would later fall to the sword in another battle, as Ajayi later learned. For Ajayi, thus began a life-changing journey of pain and triumph. Within 24 hours of captivity, Ajayi was battered for a horse and thus separated from his mother and sisters. After a few months and being exchanged between 6 owners and battered for items like tobacco and gin, Ajayi was finally sold to a Portuguese slaver who having put him alongside 186 others on his ship en route to the New World in a similar manner as thousands of Africans who had been so trafficked during those dark times in history. But in the never-ending twists and turns of Ajayi's life, the slaver's ship was intercepted by the British naval shipman Raider, commanded by Captain A.J. Leake on April 7, 1822, to set Ajayi and other captives free from this peril. The little Ajayi, now free, remembers seeing his former captor, the Portuguese slaver, now bound in fetters, and he boldly walked up to him and struck him on the head, as though that could pay for all the pains he had been through. On the 17th of June 1822, Ajayi and other rescued people set foot in Freetown, a colony that had been established by the British for receiving freed slaves. Ajayi showed himself to be a very intelligent kid, and within 6 months was already able to read the New Testament of the Bible. The young Ajayi was very studious and really enjoyed reading, as this opened his young mind to knowledge, far from the confines of his former community. The young Ajayi kept growing in knowledge, and on 11th December 1825, Ajayi took a life-changing decision as he converted to Christianity and got baptized, receiving his new name Samuel Ajayi Crowder after a venerable clergyman, the Reverend Samuel Crowder, Vicar of Christ Church, Newgate Street, London, and one of the first committee of the Church Missionary Society. He put this event ever so eloquently thus:
About the 3rd year of my liberation from the slavery of man, I was convinced of another worse state of slavery, namely that of sin and Satan. It pleased the Lord to open my heart. I was admitted into the visible church of Christ here on earth as a soldier to fight manfully under his banner against our spiritual enemies.
In 1827, The Church Missionary Society established Fura Bay College to develop Christian leadership for Africa. It eventually offered the first Western type university education in tropical Africa, and Crowder was one of its first students and later on appointed as schoolmaster in the same college. On March 1827, Samuel Crowder got married to Susan Asson Thompson, who also was a rescued slave on the same ship that brought Crowder to Freetown back in the early years, with whom he had 3 daughters and 3 sons and lived happily with until Artemis at Lagos in 1881. Crowder continued his work in Sierra Leone as a schoolmaster and evangelist, helping out with the missionary endeavor of the Church Missionary Society until 1841, when a new vista of opportunity that would greatly expand his influence opened up for him. The British government, in an attempt to facilitate trade in the interiors of the area now known as Nigeria, decided to send an expedition team into the heart of the Niger in order to assess things. Crowder was assigned to join this expedition, where his talent as a linguist enabled him to take notes of the languages of the people he came in contact with, things which he made good use of in his future work. The expedition itself was, however, a disaster, as many people on board the ship died from fever before the ship returned to Freetown. The journey had to be aborted due to the high casualties suffered. Of the 150 Europeans on board, 42 died within 2 months. Even at that, Crowder's performance on the journey, however, impressed the more experienced missionaries, as his character shone through in the dark moments of affliction. This marked him out for future responsibilities, and so he was summoned by the CMS to England in 1842, where he was ordained as a presbyter of the church, making him the first African to be so elevated. Back in the 1830s, some of the captive Saros, that is, people like Ajayi Crowder, who were freed from captivity by the British Navy and resettled in Sierra Leone, started returning back to Abeokuta and Lagos to establish trade. These returnees, who had been converted to Christianity, then petitioned the Church Missionary Society in London to send missionaries to them. After some initial scouting by the Reverend Henry Townsend, the CMS dispatched Ajayi Crowder alongside others to evangelize the people. Crowder and the team departed in December 1844 and arrived at Badagry in January 1845, where Sunday services began under the shade of a big tree. In June of the same year, Ajayi Crowder and the team finally made their way to Abeokuta, enduring so much troubles on the way. They were warmly received by the Abeokuta people, who gave land, contributed money, and men for the building of the church house. These people had liberated relatives of their own, and as such, their warm reception of the missionaries. It was also here at Abeokuta that Crowder got reunited with his mother and sister, whom he had been separated from for over 20 years when he was sold as a 12-year-old boy. In describing the moment when he met his beloved mother, Ajayi Crowder wrote,
The text for today in the Christian Almanac is, Thou art the helper of the fatherless. I have never felt the force of this text more than I did this day, as I have to relate that my mother, from whom I was torn away about 5 and 25 years ago, came with my brother in quest of me. When she saw me, she trembled. She could not believe her own eye. We grasped one another, looking at one another in silence and great astonishment, while the big tears rolled down her emaciated cheek. She trembled as she held me by my hand and called me by the familiar names. Omomi, Okomi, Oloworini, Ajayi Ogidiolu, Onikanga Adipon, which I well remember I used to be called by my grandmother, who has since died in slavery. We could not say much. We sat still, casting many an affectionate look towards each other, a look which violence and oppression had long checked, an affection which 25 years had not extinguished. My 2 sisters, who were captured with me, and their children, are all residing with my mother. I cannot describe my feelings. I have given up all hope, and now, after a separation of 25 years, without any plan or device of mine, we were brought together again.
Crowder's mother narrated to him the story of deep sorrow and pain, how she and her daughters had regained their freedom, having been redeemed by a relative. They had nothing of the lost Ajayi, The sisters got married and had children, and after a time of peace and safety, the mother and her eldest daughter were again kidnapped. While the daughter was ransomed by her husband, who only had money for one person, the mother was sold as a domestic slave until she was ransomed by her daughter. Madam Afala became Crowder's first convert in Abeokuta and was baptized by her own son Samuel and was given the name Hannah on February 5, 1848 at Abeokuta. The work in Abeokuta progressed until news of the approach of the notorious Dawami army plunged the city into dismay and almost threatened the work. In the ensuing battle, the Dawami army initially had the upper hand, forcing the Egbers into a defensive formation as they had to retreat into the city walls to repel the Dawami assault. They were able to turn things around and effectively defeated the Dawami, capturing many of the famous Amazons, while some others died in battle. The town was thus delivered and the missionary endeavor spared. In 1851, Ajayi Crowther returned to England, where he addressed a large audience comprising students of the University of Cambridge. He also met the Queen of England on his visit and recounts reading the Lord's Prayer to her in Yoruba language, to which the Queen responded that the language sounded soft and melodious. On his return to Abeokuta, Crowther embarked on another expedition up the Niger River, this time with a lot more success than the previous endeavor. This voyage took him through the delta to the Nupe country, going as far as the borders of the great city of Kano in present-day northern Nigeria. He struck up friendships with local chiefs and leaders in an attempt to introduce Christianity in these parts and also get them to abandon the slave trade and switch to trade in agricultural goods like cotton and palm oil. He was also able to develop detailed sketches of the geographical features of the areas which he later on presented to the British Society for Geography. On the back of this journey, the CMS was able to establish mission outposts in places like Onitsha, Akasa, Lokoja, Boni, and other places with varying degrees of success. Given his effort and abilities, Ajayi Crowther was appointed first bishop of the Niger in 1864, with a mandate to oversee and expand the missionary endeavors in these parts. With this new mandate, Crowther returned to the Niger area, where he was pivotal to building churches and schools for the natives, with a rather backbreaking schedule that saw him making trips through several territories, some of them hostile. It was on one of such trips in 1867 that the bishop was kidnapped in Akasa by a rather disgruntled fellow who was supposedly a friend of his and demanded for ransom to the tune of £1,000 in goods. The bishop was however rescued by a team of British traders, with one of them being hit by a poisoned arrow in the ensuing melee and losing his life. The bishop, however, survived. To make his travels a lot easier and tolerable, his friends and supporters in England, of which he had not a few, decided to raise money and bought him a boat steamer which was named Henry Vane, after the man who had proposed him as bishop of the Niger. 1880s, clouds gathered over the Niger mission. Crowther was old. Some of the early white missionaries who had supported him, like Henry Vane, were dead. The morality or efficiency of members of Crowther's staff was increasingly questioned by white British missionaries. Mission policy, racial attitudes, and evangelical spirituality had taken new directions, and the discovery of quinine meant that the malaria deaths which hitherto deterred white missionaries from venturing too deep into the hinterland was no longer a big factor. So new sources of European missionaries were now available. By degrees, Crowther's mission was dismantled through financial controls. These saw young Europeans taking over and dismissing, suspending, or transferring the African staff. Although in the several investigations carried out, the bishop's personal integrity was consistently affirmed, but the turn of events left Crowther desolate, and he died of a stroke on the 31st of December 1891 in his home in Lagos. He was buried at Ajele Cemetery in Lagos, and a European bishop succeeded him. Despite the persecution he faced towards the end of his illustrious career, Bishop Crowder demonstrated much grace and meekness in those difficult times. In 2014, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, on the occasion of the 200th year of the Niger Mission, rendered an unreserved apology to the Crowder family for the treatment of Bishop Crowder in those later years of his life. His role in producing the Yoruba Bible, which set new standards for later African translations, was crucial. Behind his efforts was a determination to provide Africans with the social and cultural tools they needed to, as a people, survive the interaction with a predatory civilization brought to Africa's shores by Europeans. Among his other publications were the Vocabulary of the Yoruba Language, which was published in 1843, Crowder's Grammar of the Yoruba Language, also published in 1852, a Grammar and Vocabulary of the Nupe Language in 1864, the Vocabulary of the Igbo Language in 1882. Crowder's visit to Britain in 1851 influenced government, church, and public opinion about Africa. Crowder pioneered an early form of Christian-Muslim dialogue for Africa. He oversaw J.C. Taylor's groundbreaking work in Igbo land and directed the evangelization of the Niger Delta, with notable results at such centers as Bonny. Crowder's Niger mission also represents the first sustained missionary engagement with African Islam in contemporary times. In the upper Niger areas in Crowder's time, Islam, largely accepted by the chiefs, was walking slowly through the population in coexistence with the old religion. From his experiences in Sierra Leone, Crowder understood that Islamic practice could merge with traditional views of power. He found a demand for Arabic Bibles, but was cautious about supplying them unless he could be sure they would not be used for charms. His insight was justified later when the young European missionaries who succeeded him wrote out passages of scriptures on request, pleased at such a means of scripture distribution. They stirred up the anger of Muslim clerics, not because they were circulating Christian scriptures, but because they were giving them free, thus undercutting the trade in Quranic charms. In discussion with Muslims, Crowder sought common ground and found it at the nexus of Quran and Bible. Christ as a great prophet, his miraculous birth, Gabriel as a messenger of God, and so on. He enjoyed courteous and friendly relations with Muslim rulers, and his writings trace various discussions with rulers, courtiers, and clerics, recording the questions raised by Muslims and his own answers, the latter as far as possible in the words of scripture. Crowder was an outspoken opponent against accepting polygamists into the Anglican Church. He wrote a memo against the practice of polygamy that influenced Anglican Church thinking on the issue. Today, the areas where Bishop Crowder's pioneering effort took place have the largest concentration of Anglicans in the world. He will forever be remembered by the Nupes, the Igalas, the Okrika, Bonny, the Bini, the Onishas, the Shakiri, and many peoples of the Delta and Eastern Nigeria, not the least his own Yoruba people. Crowder in his time labored hard for the elevation of the people of modern Nigeria through education, adoption of Christianity, and legitimate trade. It is therefore fitting that a university owned by the Anglican Communion in Nigeria was named after him. His son-in-law, the Reverend Thomas Babington Macaulay, was also the first principal of the first secondary school in Nigeria, that is the CMS Grammar School, Lagos. His grandson, Abat Macaulay, whose face is imprinted on the Nigerian 1 naira coin, played some role in securing Nigeria's independence from Britain, while the late Dr. Stella Amadeville, who was a sixth-generation descendant of the bishop, is remembered for her valor in stemming what would have been a disastrous Ebola outbreak in Nigeria, and in the process paid the ultimate price. One can then say that Crowder was a gift that keeps giving to Nigeria. So you're still watching this video at this point. Thank you very much. You are the real deal. Now, my reason for doing this video is very simple. I think that Crowder's life, as you probably would have seen in the video, offers a lot of lessons for us today. His dedication, his commitment, his story is simply inspiring. And I hope that this man's story will inspire a new generation of Nigerians and Africans. And apart from his Christian faith, one of the things you also observe was that the sort of education that he received empowered him a lot to achieve a lot of the things that he did. For someone who was at a point of exchange for us. And that provides a lot of lessons for those who govern today. They need to prioritize the education of Africans as one of the biggest ways to develop the continent. Thank you so much for watching. So keep me going to support what I'm doing.
Now, the Niger mission of 1857, which we heard about in the video. Here's a picture of them maybe relaxing while they were on their expedition. Embodied the vision of a self-supporting, self-governing, self-propagating native ministry. Samuel Crowler oversaw the mission, partially self-supporting. Crowler was fully supported by the Church Missionary Society as an Anglican ordained minister. So he was treated just the same as the white missionaries from Africa, from Europe would have been treated. All the participants were Sierra Leone Christians and predominantly Muslim territory, first sustained missionary engagement with African Islam in modern times. He was able to learn many new languages and was a gifted linguist and had some already connection with the African languages, so he was very successful. And significant translation successes were the Catechism, the Anglican Book of Worship, hymns, and scriptures. Another important document is the Organization of Native Churches in 1861. The problem to be avoided is having the native converts depend on missionary society for finances and leadership so that they imbibe the notion that all is to be done for them and not for them to do for themselves. And so they didn't want colonialism or paternalism or some of these other things. And there are some interesting books, like giving missionary books. I could recommend a few ideas, but dealing with the idea of, when helping hurts type of mentality that can bring dependence and spend money that makes people in America feel good, but really is pointless on the mission field and doesn't really accomplish anything of lasting value. Especially because you're trying to solve a problem in a Western way that is not going to be sustained by the local population later on, because it's not their way of doing it. But you couldn't get Americans to give money for doing it the African way, let's say. So you've got a big problem there. Train the native converts in the principles of self-government. Give them a course in Robert's Rules of Order. And just make sure that you don't table it indefinitely. So teach them how to run an organization. Or you might even help them just become competent in their own traditional way of running an organization. That too would be important. Develop the principles of responsibility of supporting native teachers. So you need to convince them that they need to give money so that the native preachers will have salary. Because if you don't, they aren't necessarily going to take on that responsibility. And these principles are of the independence need to be implemented in the first stages for them to successfully take root. If, when you're first starting the mission, you don't encourage some giving, The people may not be able to give a lot, but have them give something. Encourage them to give a little, to have some skin in the game. If you train them to be dependent early on, when you finally say, oh, now you're old enough to take over, they might feel offended, or they might not want to, or they might not anything. And therefore, the mission won't survive. For them, they decided how to develop a successful native church. And these were the 6 things. First, converts form into Christian companies for mutual support and encouragement. They called them companies, but they could have been what we might consider today to be small groups or whatever the case may be. Led in scripture reading and prayer by a native headman who would meet with the local church missionary society missionary for spiritual counsel. So you divide up the local population into groups, whatever you want to call them. You don't have to call them company, Christian companies. Call them cell groups, call them discipleship groups, call them whatever works in your context, and then have a native person be involved with scripture reading, prayer, and basic sub-leadership who would be under the supervision of a missionary. Each meeting, contributions would be made to the native church fund. And so you would take an offering that would go into the local treasury of the local church, not given to the Anglican missionary, so that there would be a separate native church fund. A local congregation would be formed out of several companies led by a teacher paid from the native fund. So once you had enough of these little small groups that you could make a church, you would then hire a native pastor, and that person would be paid from the native fund that you've been contributing to. The natives of the local national population would contribute to, and they would then be able to already have a tradition of self-support, and they would have hopefully a buffer of cash that's already in hand when you get this started. Several congregations would form a native pastorate under an ordained native pastor paid by the native fund, and success for the Anglican mission would be when a mature independent native pastorate under an African bishop did not receive any foreign agency whatsoever. The goal would be to eventually develop a whole district of churches that you could set off as a denomination or maybe a district of the Anglican Church that would be fully self-supporting and self-sustaining, and might actually send money to the Archbishop of Canterbury as a full participant in the Anglican Communion, and this would be true of the Wesleyan Church, Nazarene Church, whatever group you're trying to do. This plan was one that has a sense that might actually work. So, when we come back, we are going to look at how the first attempt to set up a native pastorate in Sierra Leone went. It didn't go very well, but just be aware that the first attempt at these things usually doesn't go very well, but it's the fact that you're going to put it into practice and then eventually it will be successful. And we will see the development of a native church. So, okay, we'll come back and start at this place next week, Wednesday, and then continue on. All right, see you then. Are you, Gideon, are you Anglican?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.